site, and we will be live starting now.
Somebody's just started making noises outside.
Perfect.
Are you getting any sound coming from here? Somebody started rapping outside.
Listen, that's what theater is these days, yeah.
Yes, the sounds of New York.
Are you in New York?
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. I wasn't sure if you were in New York or if you were across the pond.
Yeah, it's obvious from my accent I'm in New York.
Yes, of course, clearly.
Hang on, I'm going to raise this up now that we've got things running. Aha. Get more light. Okay. Tell us when we're ready to roll.
Well, I think we're live. Are we on?
We are live.
All right.
Well, hello everyone. The metaphorical curtain is up. This is the Foreign Press Association of New York and the US. I'm the president, Ian Williams, and our guest today is Lee Seymour, who is a columnist for Forbes and writes extensively about the economics of show business and Broadway. And one of the things that we can say about show business is there's no show at the moment, and not much business either. So that's one of the things we'll be, that's the main thing that we're discussing today. Yesterday came the news, I believe, that the Metropolitan Opera has cancelled the next season, even as a putative and tentative one. In the meantime, the marquees are dark, and of course, Broadway records bums on seats, was the way they used to put it, bottoms on seats, and there aren't any. In some parts, apparently in London, the West End is still has people sitting on seats occasionally. Here, not at all. So, I mean, I think one of the first questions I'd like you to discuss, Lee, is, theatre, Broadway finance was always fairly arcane. As far as I know, we're still working on the zero Mostel principle of conning old ladies out of their life savings and sort of informal pools of investors and angels. But at the moment, all of the angels have fallen. Did they take a serious hit with the closure of Broadway? Did a lot of people lose money on those shows?
Yes, it's sort of an odd question, right? Because there are some shows that close and won't reopen, and those shows have lost their entire capitalization. So, I think the only ones that have officially announced, there's a lot of shows that have sort of tentatively said, we're waiting for an opening date and we'll let you know we're reopening then. But Hangman, which is the new Martin McDonagh play, is not going to be reopening, and the revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf won't be reopening. So the funds raised for those shows, like you said, each show is its own independent LLC. And Broadway is an industry, but it's an industry, it's a collective. It's made up of independent LLCs and nonprofits. And you can think of each commercial show, at least, as its own sort of startup. And they do one round of fundraising. Sometimes you can raise additional funds if you've started a show out of town. So you raise the money for the out of town, if you're in Chicago or Boston or somewhere, and then you move to Broadway and you raise additional funds. But that's it, that's your money. Extraordinary circumstances, you can take out a loan if you think that maybe it'll help you kind of get through award season to win a Tony. But
you can find someone to give you a loan.
Say what?
If you can find somebody to give you a loan.
Exactly. Usually you go back to your wealthiest investors and see if they want to double down. But it's a rare move, and that usually doesn't pan out very well. So for the shows that have closed and have announced they won't be reopening, that money is all gone. In the meantime, it's this sort of excruciating limbo where there's a very good chance that, say you are an investor in a show like The Book of Mormon or Wicked, or any of these shows that have both a sort of brand appeal, they've been long running and they still have an audience for them. If those shows reopen smartly and well and do so safely, they'll be able to start making money again. But this year, I mean, there's not going to be, if you have money in any of the shows that closed in March, you're not going to be making any of that back this year. There's no revenue streams coming in. Revenue is purely ticket driven, and there's no tickets. So yeah, it's going to be a lost year from that perspective.
And I mean, the ones that have definitively closed, where they've sort of they've scuttled the show.
Yeah.
Is that because they've looked and thought, it's not going to float, or is it because, you know, you have to get so many ducks in a row? You have to get the cast, you have to get the orchestra, you have to get the theatre, you have to get all the rest of it. And if one part of the chain falls apart, the rest might, you know, it breaks the back of the whole chain.
Yeah, I think it's a little column A, a little column B, where certainly for a show like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf that had a big star like Laurie Metcalf in it, my guess would be, although I don't know if this is was officially part of the press announcement, my guess would be that part of it was scheduling. To be able to reassemble that team wasn't a thing that could be guaranteed. There also just may have been shows. So the real thing that you have to think about here is if you're going to reopen a show or thinking about reopening a show, there are costs associated with that. And that's the cost of re-rehearsing, remarketing, building up your advanced sales again to develop a sort of cash flow for the show. And for a lot of new shows, a lot of new plays, ones that are opening, that would have opened this season, plays in particular, because their capitalizations, their budgets tend to be smaller, they run leaner than musicals. For shows in those positions, there's not a whole lot of cash on hand if you're not already selling like gangbusters. If you've got to build up your brand and you're not, you know, the big buzzy play of the season, which for example, Hangman wasn't necessarily, it had gotten good reviews, it was building up, it wasn't selling out for its first couple of weeks of previews, it was doing fine. My guess would be that they just didn't have enough money reserved to be able to responsibly say to their investors and their cast that we can reopen this, period. They might have just looked at the numbers and said, if we try to reopen this, it is going to cost more to re-rehearse for a month this show than we have in advance sales and cash on hand. They probably just said, we're out.
What I mean, part of the business equation has got to be whether there's any theatres and audience there. I mean, the long-term prospects for the Great White Way under these circumstances must look a bit like a dead end, with all the reports of, you know, the death of New York, death of Midtown. Nobody's quite sure when the plague will hit again. The Elizabethans very quietly, very presciently closed all their theatres down when the bubonic plague hit London. So,
yeah.
we expect things like that here.
It's a good question, and it's one that nobody really has an answer to yet. So the conversations that people are having right now and trying to build contingency plans for are reduced audience, for sure. I mean, the big questions are, when will people feel safe coming back to the theater? How much would they be willing to spend, and where are they coming from? So Broadway, about 2/3 of its audience are tourists. They're not from the New York area. Now, most of those tourists are domestic tourists. They're from other places in the United States, and a lot of them are from the East Coast. So you can think about it being that they may still be more likely to come to a show when it reopens than somebody who, for example, has to fly on a plane. It's a second barrier to entry. You find a plane, you book a hotel, you come see a show. It's a whole package. And that is a really scary question to think about for some shows that really rely on international tourists. So international tourists make up about a fifth of Broadway audiences from other countries, and where they go on Broadway in terms of what shows they see varies wildly. So what we saw right before the shutdown, the last week of grosses and attendance we had, The Lion King, which is Disney's flagship, which sells out almost every week. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar property, and it's got Disney behind it, obviously. They are reliant in larger ways than other shows, especially newer plays are, on international tourism. And we saw that once the travel restrictions went into place the week or two before the shutdown really began. I spoke to some people at Disney who confirmed this, but they saw a huge drop off in audience that was driven primarily by the lack of international tourists. Now, Lion King has Disney behind it. So when Lion King wants to reopen, there's this sort of internal math that happens at Disney, which is never made public, so I can only speculate. But if Disney wants that show to run, I'm sure they can find a way to fill the gaps until the tourists feel safe coming back. But for other shows, it's a game of hedging really risky bets. And really knowing and having robust data about who your show is marketed to and who actually buys the tickets for it. So the way that the current industry leaders, and when I say that, I mean some of the more powerful and successful lead producers, as well as theater owners who make up the sort of governing body of the Broadway League, which is the industry's trade organization. The way that the current thought patterns are going is that we've got legacy shows and then other shows, new shows. So the legacy shows are shows that have been running for decades, that are huge, big brands. So like The Lion King, Hamilton is in there, Wicked, shows like that. And that's a whole separate set of concerns and questions to be asking, because they're enormous shows, they're deeply complex to get running, they employ hundreds of people, they have casts of dozens, versus, say, a new play like the Lehman trilogy, which was, I think it had maybe 2 or 3 previews before everything shut down. That's a 3-person play. It's really New York based. The New York audience was really heavily going for it. And that's an entirely different set of considerations to look into when you are trying to reopen a show, because the first people who are probably going to come back to shows in New York are the local audiences, the people who don't have to get on a plane or a train to come test the waters.
So, I mean, presumably there's work in progress, and people planning new types of drama, sort of a lot more single-handers, Hamlet played by one person changing costumes.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's a really good question. There's a deep vested interest in the industry of bringing back certain marquee shows, like these legacy shows, that feel like they stand for what Broadway is internationally, certainly around the country. But looking at the economics, I mean, even if you look at the economics of it, it's not going to be, well, I don't want to say it's not going to be possible. Anything's potentially possible, but it will be deeply challenging to break even on a show's weekly running costs if they are above a certain dollar amount. And if you are not able to, well, I mean, that's just a sort of truism. You need to make your weekly running costs each week to stay open. What I mean is that with a diminished audience and a diminished buyer base, at least at first, especially if you're a show that relies on international tourists, you've got to think really hard about what it means to open earlier or to kind of sit in your theater and wait until maybe later on. So there's that aspect of it. But I think, to your question, yeah, I think that there's probably going to be, I would not be surprised to find that we would have Broadway over the next couple of years would resemble something more like what it looked like in the 60s and 70s, which if anyone here is interested, there's a book called The Season by William Goldman, I think I've got his name right, who documented an entire season of Broadway about 50 years ago, and what some of it still really holds to today, which is this rapid turnover of shows. You had shows that cost a lot less, and that opened and closed with significant frequency at smaller losses. And a lot of them were plays, a lot of them were smaller, like you're saying, 1, 2, 3-handers. I would not be surprised to find that's a bigger chunk of the Broadway landscape over the next couple of years, because those are the shows that you don't have to raise a lot of money for, and they don't cost a lot of money each week. So if you've got a one-person play doing Hamlet, changing costumes themselves on stage, where you don't have to have dressers in confined quarters, that's going to be a much easier show to run just from a dollar perspective than a 40-person musical adaptation of, you know, yet another beloved nostalgic 90s movie.
What about, you know, any innovative ways of presenting them? I know that some theatre groups have been doing Zoom performances.
Yes. Yes, I think it's another, again, these are all good questions, and very few of them have definitive answers right now, and they depend on who you ask. The sort of conventional wisdom, which, as we are discovering now, is not all that wise, is that if you have some sort of footage of your show, if you record it, if you stream it, if you you know, film it in any way and then release it for public consumption, either in movie theaters or online, that you would cannibalize your ticket sales. That's the word that often comes up. And there's increasing evidence that is not the case. So for example, I mean, the big one that we have right now is Hamilton on Disney+. And the number of people who were never going to see Hamilton in New York, not because they didn't want to, not because maybe they didn't have the money to go see it, but because it was a travel imposition. They were never going to be able to take vacation time. They were never going to be able to make it past the multiple barriers of entry into New York on Broadway, despite their deep interest. They've all been able to see it now, and they have earned money for the show and for its producers and for its investors via the streaming platform. So there is, I think, increased interest. There's another musical, Diana, that was, or is currently being filmed for Netflix, as though it were it's being filmed on stage, and they're going to be releasing that, I think, next month in October. We'll see how that goes. That's a brand new musical. There's functionally no brand behind it, unlike Hamilton.
Is that the one with the car crash?
It must be. It's about the People's Princess.
Well, I hope they have fire marshals there, even on a virtual stage.
We'll see how it turns out. But there's definitely increased. We're seeing a deep appetite for it. We're seeing an understanding that filmed theater is not the same thing as theater in person, and that the real clutch messaging part of this is that we shouldn't be marketing filmed work as though it's a replacement for live theater, but rather as an augmentation to the product that we know and love and will get back to eventually.
I mean, part of the attraction of live theatre is being crammed in with lots of other people and smelling the pheromones and the excitement. If you can smell the pheromones, you can inhale the virus. So this is not a good huggery.
No, it's going to be tough, and you know, I've got no doubt that the industry will revive itself, that we will be going back to theaters, but it's going to be a long time. And you know, I won't mince words. I think there are a lot of people who have, understandably, either through vested interest or some form of denial or just general anxiety about it, who might want to paint a more vague or rosier picture. But we're in bad shape. And it's a really bad situation. We've got hundreds of thousands of people who are employed directly by theater or indirectly in ancillary businesses who are unemployed. The industry is hemorrhaging talent. People are leaving for good. People are leaving New York. Other people are moving into New York. You know, I think these op-eds of New York is dead are histrionic, overblown, mostly nonsense. But what's not nonsense is that we're in a position where until there is a sense that it will be safe, like you say, to smell the pheromones again, and that's probably going to come in the form of some kind of widespread vaccine, or at the very least reliable therapeutics and preventatives, even if it's not a vaccine.
You don't envisage individual booths surrounded with
Yeah. Listen, if Cameron McIntosh wants to tear out every seat in the Imperial Theater and build individual booths and put his money into it that way, I say more power to him. That's the only way that Phantom's going to reopen anytime soon, if that's how we're looking at it. But it's rough and it's scary, and I would be shocked. So the worst case scenario, to put it this way, is that, and just to frame this for folks who may not be as familiar with the inside baseball of the industry, right now for Broadway in New York at least, the buck stops with Governor Cuomo. We as an industry cannot reopen any of our theaters until the governor's office says gatherings of 500 people or more indoors are allowed. So even if we have the perfect safety measures, even if Cameron McIntosh remodels the entire Imperial, if we don't get the go-ahead from Cuomo, we're stuck, and that's where it is. And so we're looking ahead to, once the go-ahead is lifted, what happens then? And it's going to be a two-part process. One, off-Broadway theaters, which don't get nearly the amount of press time, but are hugely, hugely important to this theatrical ecosystem. There are hundreds of smaller spaces, and for the designation clarity, off-Broadway is a contract designation, and it basically encompasses any theater between 99 and 500 seats in Manhattan or the surrounding boroughs. And there are a couple hundred theaters that fit that bill. But those are theaters, the most prominent of them are places like the Public, the Atlantic, places like New York Theater Workshop that incubate shows that often then end up on Broadway. But they are deeply tied into the local community. Remember what I said about local audiences being the first to come back? Off-Broadway audiences are far and away, I mean, the proportions are almost entirely reversed. It's far and away more attended by local audiences. They have partnerships with local restaurants, local businesses, local communities. And because their spaces are smaller, as the rollout happens, they're most likely going to open before any Broadway spaces happen, or any Broadway spaces open. So you have 250 people allowed in a room before you have 500. And so there's this real question of, how can one support the off-Broadway theaters, which are more nimble? They don't have nearly as much at stake in terms of the capitalization numbers of Broadway commercial houses, but as a result, their margins were a lot thinner. There's less wiggle room when it comes to fat to trim in these small institutions. They're going to be the canary in a coal mine for what the larger industry looks like opening up. So that's question number one. That's step number one. And then step number two, when we come to opening the Broadway spaces, there's no industry-wide body that has mandate authority over Broadway. So remember what I said earlier, Broadway is a collection of individual, independent companies and nonprofits. So there's 41 Broadway theaters. 3/4 of those theaters are owned by 3 companies, the Schuberts, the Nederlanders, and Jew Jamson. The rest are a mix of independent owners. The Ambassador Theatre Group, which is a British company, has 2. Circle and Square is owned independently, and a couple other nonprofits. But I think it's 30 out of the 41 are owned by 3 companies. And the question is, who's going to take the plunge and try to reopen their show first? How does this actually look when every theater is different? Every theater is a different size. And even though they're all owned by a small group, they're all independently negotiated between the producers and theater owners. The Broadway League, the trade organization, which you hear a lot about, doesn't have the authority to say, this is when this show is opening, everyone has to do this, everyone has to do that. They're a trade organization. Their purpose is to facilitate negotiations between producers, theater owners, and the 14 labor unions that operate on Broadway. They also gather market research. They put out research reports. For anybody listening who's looking to do more background into this, the Broadway League website has some really, really, really useful data on demographics, on economic impact, touring, box office grosses. It's all there, and it's really worth looking into. But that's their primary purpose. The Broadway, if Cuomo says you guys are free to open, the Broadway League cannot say, great, every show has to reopen. That's not within their power. So it's up to every show. So a scary potential, and depending on which show this is, maybe even likelihood, is that there's a show that wants to open on its own. and says, great, we're going to try reopening, and there's an outbreak at that theater.
Mhm.
And then they have to shut down. And if there's an outbreak at the theater, well, let me just play this out, because it's a lot of people, you know, there's a sense that we have to race to kind of get back to reopening, race to get back in. But if it goes to, if you rush it and it gets botched, what happens is that show closes permanently. They've used up all of their excess capital to reopen. So if they open, there's an outbreak, they have to close, they're gone permanently. They're never coming back. And that then has a ripple effect on the rest of the industry, where the message then gets out is not that Broadway is back open for business, it's that Broadway is unsafe still. And that makes it even more difficult for the other shows down the pipeline. So it's going to take a real concerted effort of communication and collaboration between all of these independent entities to make sure whatever that rollout looks like isn't going to hamstring any show in particular, and isn't going to hamstring the entire industry.
We've got some questions been coming in now.
Oh,
Rose Billings wants to know, will a vaccine help? Well, an effective vaccine or a rumor of a vaccine, it all seems to be an uncertainty. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that'd be great. You know, if there's a working vaccine, you know, it's a part of this that a more delicate part of this also is the state of our political establishment. And we have the deep misfortune right now in America of having a federal government that is incoherent in its response to the pandemic, and has been.
And the arts and culture, it would seem, even on a long-term basis.
Yes. I mean, the arts and culture, so a big difference on both sides of the pond that's worth mentioning is, if you're a producer and you're looking to produce a show in London or the UK, you're only going to spend about a third as much money as you would trying to produce that exact same show in New York. And that speaks to both the deep strength of
That's the question that Gail Aronoff was about to, has got up there. The differences in finance between Broadway and Britain, and why Britain is open. And
Sure. Good question. So to finish the thought, and then to answer the question, there's been a long-standing, deep, multi-generation tradition and history in the UK that we do not have here, of government subsidized art and subsidizing of arts and culture. I
regret to say it's a passing tradition for the last decade or two compared with the past.
Sure. I mean, we're seeing, you know, if you want to pull back to a really macro view, we're in the middle of a really unsteady sine wave right now. But so what you would see in the UK, which happened, was a almost $2 billion relief package specifically for the arts and cultural sector that's about to start being divvied up and announced, I think, next month. That's not happening here. It's either for the nonprofits or the commercial sector. We are trying to push through legislation through our Congress, but there is not. There's not a precedent for it outside of relatively small grants through the National Endowment for the Arts, which is our closest. We don't have a minister of culture here. We don't have anyone with a direct line to the industry. So it's sort of backed us into the position of being a commercial entity that is supported by individual philanthropy when times get tough. There's no real government support. And the ramifications of that played out also when it comes to this issue of the vaccine. If we get a vaccine, and just to put a name on it, if Trump gets reelected and this same administration is in place of dealing with the rollout of any potential vaccines, if it is in any way similar, and our past 4 years have told us here that it probably will be, to the incoherence of the response to this pandemic leading up to this, it may not make a difference for multiple years.
It's going to look like the stage at the end of Macbeth or Hamlet, bodies strewn everywhere.
It is, bodies strewn everywhere, and then the curtain comes down, and we don't know how long that would be for. So
Jeff
for us,
Gold mentions the Barrington Theatre Pitfield as a model for reopening. I'm not quite familiar with this. Are you? Do you have pertinent thoughts on it?
I do. Let me get to that in just a second, because I realize I kind of veered away very quickly just from the last question. The difference between West End and New York, or the UK, New York, part of it's government subsidizing. The Society of London Theatres is about 70 venues. Broadway is 41, and that includes venues like the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, places that do receive a significant amount of government subsidies. But it also reflects the difference in general, both living costs, wages, and specifically the difference in unions. So I believe there's only 4 labor unions that really work within the Society of London Theatres. There's 14 that work on Broadway, all of which, or almost all of which, collectively bargain their contracts. And because of the deep influence they've held over the last couple of decades in certain work rules that have been in place, the costs of putting up shows, specifically, there's a easy gripe. I mean, listen, I say this as a small a lowercase and a capital D Democrat. I'm a member of multiple unions myself. It's easy, I think, and very damaging to just say, well, unions get paid too much, we've got to cut the unions. It's a narrative that I would really encourage anyone writing about this here to shy away from. There is an argument to be made for looking at outdated work rules, particularly when it comes to loading in and loading out shows. If you're loading in a show into a theater in New York, especially if it's a big musical, you have to bank an additional $1 to $2 million just to have on hand, just to move your set into the theater, because of how certain work rules have been codified over the last 3 to 4 decades. So there's potentially some movement there, but what this amounts to is that if you're producing a show, it's a third as expensive in London than it is in the US.
Mm-hmm.
What was Barrington. So the specifics with Barrington, I have not been there to see it yet, but they've either built or they've reorganized one of their spaces there to be an outdoor space. And they have, I believe, it's a production of Godspell that has been running there, that is sort of this test guinea pig for outdoor productions, socially distanced, building things like masks, like separators and dividers into the staging of the show itself. And because it's outdoors, being able to give, sort of like what you're saying, there's a lot of space in between people. It's sort of functionally, you get your own booth. And from my understanding, it's been working. I mean, it's sold out and extended over the last couple of weeks. I don't know what the financials look like on that. I know that they've got to charge roughly about $100 a ticket, or that's what they've been charging. That's what people have been willing to pay. I don't know the state of what it would look like if they were charging $50 to $70.
Mm-hmm.
But we also are getting into winter, so outdoor spaces, it's a good investment to look into that. Certainly come springtime, I don't think we're going to see large-scale indoor performances come springtime, but winter is going to be harrowing.
Yeah. Well, since we're speaking about audiences, Frank Gomez wants to know, can Broadway do better in finding ways to attract Latino, Black, and Asian audiences? Hamilton had great appeal with them. And he points out that, if New York City is going to revive, then most of the majority of the population in New York is minority. So, and apart from the fact they're the ones, they have a disproportionate casualty rate from COVID. Are there ways to explore them as future audiences?
Absolutely. And I think this is a conversation that every single person I've talked to at the upper echelons of the industry and on the way down are having right now. It's part of a really deep dive into self-reflection for an industry that has been traditionally and historically, I should say, and often exclusionarily white, both in terms of who it employs, in terms of which writers are produced, in terms of who runs the theaters. Every single Broadway theater is run and owned by a white person. There are no Black or otherwise people of color landlords. So there's a deep systemic imbalance in that sense, and that is a part of this narrative which is false and specious, that audiences of color just don't like Broadway, that it's not for them. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Broadway shows, I'm actually working on a piece about this right now, which is going to go live tomorrow if you're interested in reading it in Forbes. But there's a wonderful producer, his name is Brian Moreland, who's one of very few Black Broadway producers, who's really fabulous to talk with about exactly this subject. And we're talking about the myth of this myth about the industry that either audiences of color don't like coming to Broadway because it's too expensive, or because they just don't respond to marketing. Now, the reality is, one, I mean, the myth that Broadway's too expensive for people of color is outright racist. It conflates these ideas that people of color are, one, a monolith, and two, poor, neither of which are true. And you can think about it in terms of when, for example, Beyonce goes on sale. A huge number of Beyonce fans and ticket buyers are people of color. Those tickets go for $300 a pop. Done, gone, easy. The money is there. Black Americans account for $1.4 trillion in buying power last year. The money is there. The issue is that decision makers on Broadway, for whatever self-fulfilling reasons, want to believe it's not. And there's this sense that, like, well, it's not worth reaching out. And so that's the other part of this, is that audiences of color tend not to be marketed to. When you sit down in your marketing meeting and you're talking with your ad agency and marketing agency, you get your initial kind of pull list, which breaks down where your initial outreach and ad buys are going to go by borough, by district, by zip code, by demographics. And over again, Black and brown majority districts and zip codes are just not on those lists.
So the Amsterdam News is not going to get a large advertising spend.
Right, of course. However, if for example, every single producer made a commitment on Broadway from now on that they would only produce and they would only work with a marketing firm if they included two districts that were majority people of color, we would see an increased audience. There is a perception that is not real, that people of color don't come.
Well, Hamilton is a case in point, isn't it? Certainly the students at BMCC, where I've been teaching, a lot of them have been to see Hamilton. A lot of them want to go and see Hamilton if they could afford it, on your other point. But
yes. Yes, I mean, and Hamilton's a really interesting example. You know, if there have been multiple articles done of interviews of the cast members who are primarily people of color, looking out at the audience and seeing more people of color on stage than are in the house. And Hamilton, I think, and the producers, Jeffrey and his team, do a great job specifically to educational outreach, like you're saying. There have been huge numbers set aside for students and students of color. But Hamilton it's this odd example of a show where the discourse around it is beginning to change, where it's a show that highlights and supplants white people on stage, but is still primarily patronized by white people, and the lion's share of the money that show makes goes to the white producers, all of whom are white. So there's this fundamental tension that is built in that deserves and is getting scrutiny and some serious reflection.
From Tinitin Japaradzada, who had her own Broadway show in production at one point, and is a notable singer. Is there a local, state or city plan that takes into account the pandemic's effect on performers? Is the Actors Fund, for example, considering an aid package? Because one of the problems with this epidemic is most of the funding and relief has been aimed at people in regular employment, and people in the cultural industries are tend not to be in regular employment, and it's very difficult to do the paperwork, to get aid, to get unemployment. If you've been casually working all along, the chances are you tend to fall out the envelope when it comes to any aid packages. So,
absolutely, and it's tragic. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier of theater and the arts, especially in America, have been sort of relegated. Either you are a purely commercial endeavor, or you are at the mercy of a private philanthropist. So in terms of aid package, there are a number of different bills that are, as I said, kind of stalled out in Congress right now that hopefully will be lumped into larger aid packages. But there's the Save Our Stages bill there that you might want to look into. That was co-sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican, John Cornyn and Amy Klobuchar. There are any number, so the Actors Fund, and there are a number of other funds that have been raising huge, incredible sums of money to, in terms of direct aid to people in the arts who are unemployed. But that's all, again, that's all private philanthropy. None of that is governmentally organized at either the state or the federal level. So hopefully we will see a more robust built-in aid package that is not nearly as Byzantine as you're saying, in to kind of work through the paperwork for, but it's a ways off, especially since the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. That seems to have made the gridlock in our Congress even worse than it was before. And it's hard for me to see an aid package coming through before the election, to be totally honest.
I take it you don't see a federal relief and works agency providing employment for artists and actors and writers in the near future?
Not under this administration.
But even under the other administration?
It's possible. I mean, it happened after the Great Depression, and in the midst of World War II. There was an enormous, oh God, the name's escaping me. It's something like the New Works Fund or the Theater Works Fund project.
NWA, I think it was.
Sorry, say that again, Ian?
I think it was the NWA, wasn't it?
Something. I can look it up and pull it up and send it out to anyone who's watching. But it was a massive federal aid project that then led into what a lot of people call the golden age of Broadway. And then after that, the regional theater movements, that we've now got hundreds of regional theaters that are a major part of the arts economy. And just to frame this, if you're looking for statistics, arts and culture in America, that industry, which includes theater, live entertainment, music, TV, and film, accounts for 4.5% of our GDP. It's enormous and employs millions and millions of people. And for me, the untold narrative here, if any of you are looking into highlighting this is the real key takeaway, is that even though these industries bring in enormous amounts of money, have enormous, 4.5% of the GDP comes directly from the arts, employs millions of people, it is treated as an afterthought of charity. It's not, these industries don't get the same kind of bailouts that
cruise companies, offshore cruise companies.
It's egregious. I mean, I can't even tell you how angry it makes me, but that's the story. That's the real takeaway here, is that there are millions of people who are unemployed, who are leaving the industry, who can't find work elsewhere because it's so specialized in skill set, who are American workers, who do contribute massive amounts to the economy, and they are an afterthought. And that's the shortfall.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're probably regarded as parasitic liberals by the people with the money. Tinnitin also picks up on a thought that we had earlier. To what extent is the digital platform a viable supplement, not a direct replacement for the real thing? You know, as the pandemic lumbers on slowly, are people going to research ways to sort of get the theatre experience in the comfort of your own living room, where you we can home in and get the theatre experience, where you can sort of get sprayed by the saliva as the actor.
Well, I don't know I don't know how quickly the research and development is moving on of, ersatz saliva spritzers for your home entertainment theater. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. These digital platforms and digital products, I mean, we're also such in the early stages of this to remember, there's a lot of people who are still using Zoom, but another thing that I highlight, there's a program that's being developed by La Mama, which is a old, very storied, excellent off-Broadway experimental theater company they're developing called Culture Lab, I believe, which is an online digital platform for recording theater that is specifically tailored to performance. So Zoom, we all know what Zoom is. This is Zoom. There's not much you can do with it. This platform and others like it that are being developed are specifically being done so that you can do things like mimic choreography with the screens, that can mimic lighting, that can give you more of a real specified, tailored experience. And what we're seeing so far, and again, like I said, we'll see how Diana turns out, but
it has a sad ending.
Say what?
It has a sad ending.
It does, right? Yes. We'll see how the story turns out. It's gonna be a real cliffhanger. But in terms of how that's actually responded to, we've seen it already in Hamilton. I mean, that the success on that platform on Disney Plus for that show, which is just a recorded show, is extraordinary. And it's also an extraordinary show. It's a weird thing to compare things to, and I would caution anyone writing about this to use Hamilton as a barometer of normalcy in the industry, because it's not. It's truly exemplary.
An exception, isn't it? In every way.
In every way. However, it does point in this case to digital platforms being desirable and profitable when it comes to additional revenue streams for theatrical shows.
Let me see. Jeff Gold wants to know Mr. Bowman's view of the often fragile talent ecosystems that feed Broadway. And we mentioned this in the UK, the rep non-profit theatres feeding the West End, included residence theatres and off and off Broadway. All those dressers, choreographers, ushers, lighters, and other. Do you have a view of whether in-person theatre audiences will be lost to the online streaming platforms, whether there is a future for these people, or whether they should be deciding whether it's time to cut bait or go fish?
Oh, it's a really good question. Let me see if I understand this correctly. We're talking about in the interim, when all we really
those
have
14
is
unions you were talking about, all of those people, whose jobs are specifically tied to three-dimensional physical stagecraft. How much of a future do they have, and are there alternatives?
I think some skill sets are transferable for sure. I mean, the I think really crushing answer is that it's going to be lean times. The ultimate answer is yes, there will be a future. There is no, I don't see a world in which live indoor performance does not come back and is not desperately needed and desperately celebrated and desperately paid for and patronized. I do think it's going to be a long time. And so the question really is, what we are seeing, I mean, it's not even a question, we're seeing talent bleed from the industry, from these specialized professions. And some of them are finding work elsewhere. Some of them are living off of savings right now. Some of them are going to transition.
COVID's affecting their normal refuges will be
Exactly.
TV or movie performances, and they are very constrained as well, since they involve large masses of people breathing germs in each other's faces.
Yes, I mean, yeah, what we call the survival jobs over here, especially for artists in between gigs. Nobody's going to bars, nobody's going to restaurants. It's bleak. Yeah.
But is there? I mean, we have the Broadway League, we have the others. Is anybody sitting down, wargaming for the future?
I assume so. I mean, my understanding is that everyone who is in a position of power or leverage or negotiation is taking advantage of that. The question is, what real movement is there? I mean, there's only so many ways you can slash a budget for a show that isn't currently running. There's only so many deferred rent payments that can be accrued before an insurance company has to come in and either cover or say, sorry, we're not covering this. Which is, this is what we're finding now, and this is a huge piece of the puzzle, is that insurance companies aren't willing to cover nearly as much of the lost expenses as producers and theater owners expected them to, and found they were going to. So there's a lawsuit, I believe, happening right now with Jew Jamson, who, as I said, they own 5 Broadway theaters, and they're run by Jordan Roth. And Jew Jamson is, I believe, suing its insurance provider because they're only covering, you know, a fraction of what they said they might or what they expected to.
They're behaving like insurance companies. They'll let it be a warning.
Say what?
They're behaving like insurance companies. Let it be a warning.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's only so much room to move before people leave. I mean, that's the really bleak truth of this, is there's only so much wargaming that somebody can do without a show to run, and without people who feel safe enough to sit for a couple of hours next to another person.
It just occurred that, in a way, we mentioned the theatres in London closing because of the plague in Elizabethan times, but maybe the Globe is the future, an open air theatre with fresh air coming in. And
yeah, I mean, I love the Globe. I actually spent a summer doing a Shakespeare training there back in a former life, and it's a fantastic institution. I mean, the Globe, so my sense would be that institutions like the Globe would open before certain indoor theaters. And to go back to an earlier point, just to tie this together, the reason that we're seeing certain theaters and certain shows try to reopen in London right now when Broadway can't is, as I said, the costs are just so much lower. Unions are less powerful, and also it's only certain small shows. So Six the Musical is a fabulous example. It's 6 people on stage, which is right now the minimum number of people that you can have indoors in the UK, I believe, which is a paradox in terms of if you're trying to pack your house. I don't know how that works, but it's functionally a concert. There's no intermission, so you don't need to worry about bathroom lines. You don't need to worry about what it's going to be like in cramped quarters. It's 80 minutes long, and it seems like they are able to, because it costs so much less to run per week. I think it's about $100,000 a week to run that show in the UK, about £70,000. In the States, it's about $300,000 to run that show. I would guess maybe a little bit more, maybe somewhere between 3 and 5, somewhere in that range. So you can make it work in London, ostensibly, if there's not another outbreak. And the reason that Kenny Wax and the producers of these shows are pushing it now is because, at least as far as I understand, and Ian, you might have a better sense than I do, that a certain round of government coverage and subsidy for furloughed workers is coming to an end. So they're really pushing, instead of permanently laying people off, they are trying to bring back some jobs in a limited capacity. And we'll see how well that works. The numbers, they could make it work. The real question, I'm sorry, as I knocked my computer over, is whether or not the currently, daily tripling cases of new viruses in the UK are going to make it impossible one way or another.
Well, I mean, the truth about the old alliance is still there. We're cursed with equal incompetence on the part of the heads of government on both sides of the Atlantic.
There you go.
Even some level of buffoonery, perhaps. What about, we're coming towards the end. Are there any last questions from people out there before we go? Going, gone. I think we get the dong. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Leah. It's an area that people haven't thought about very much. It's out of space, out of mind.
Yeah.
People haven't been thinking, how do I dig a tunnel out of my apartment and get to Broadway? I can see Broadway.
It's true.
Window, in fact, but I have no tunnel, and getting to the theatre is not a perennial issue. Getting to the grocery store and the post office is a bigger one, mostly. Thank you very much. So we should really follow up on this and see what happens in a few months' time. And if you do let us know if there's any, if the Broadway Alliance does get a plan. But at the moment, it does seem to be all good to be over by Christmas, which is famous last words.
Not going to happen. We're going to be dealing with this for a long time. And all I would leave you with, Ian, is to your point of, theater is not a perennial issue. What really matters is people being able to pay their rent and buy groceries. I absolutely agree with you. The issue that I hope everyone taking away from this understands is that there are millions of people who, in order to buy their groceries and pay their rent, depend on their jobs in the theater. And that's where we're really stuck.
And there's lots more of us who depend on making life on thin gruel and cold coffee bearable through culture and art. So this is Ian Williams, the president of the Foreign Press Association. We have more coming up soon. Next week, we have Bianca Jagger speaking about Nicaragua and Ortega. That's a home country. I was trying to arrange for it to come in on a white horse, as she did in Studio 54, the pictures that just come from the Brooklyn Museum. But I think she's coming in on Zoom, no white horse, unfortunately. We have other press conferences coming up with people. We're always looking for suggestions. Please, if you enjoyed this, pass it on to other people, refer to our YouTube site, and join the Foreign Press Association if you're eligible, and put yourself on our mailing list otherwise. But once again, thank you very much, Lee. It's very informative, and let's say it's almost amusing. Good as a stage show, single-hander. Well done, Lee.
I do my best.
We'll get an Oscar for it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
guys.
everybody.
Take care.